All right, let's talk about the Bible of psychiatry. It's the one book that defines every single mental disorder we know of. But right now, it's facing a massive crisis, a crisis that could totally rewrite how we think about mental health. So, for decades, this book, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or what everyone just calls the DSM, has been the absolute authority. It lists almost 300 conditions, and it's what your doctor uses to diagnose everything from major depression to schizophrenia. But here's the kicker. For all its power and influence, a growing chorus of experts are coming out and saying that its whole approach, well, that it's just not scientifically valid. A pretty big claim, right? Okay, let's really dig into this. Why is this foundational text, something that doctors and even insurance companies depend on every single day, suddenly getting so much heat from inside the scientific community itself? This right here is the heart of the problem. See, the whole idea of the DSM was to create these neat, clean, separate boxes for different disorders based on symptoms. The only issue is our biology, our genetics and brain scans, it just doesn't fit into those tidy boxes. So, because of this growing gap between the book and the science, the American Psychiatric Association, the people who published the DSM, have announced a pretty radical plan to completely reshape the manual for the future. The APA's big plan, which they've laid out in 5 new papers, really has 3 main parts. First, they want to allow for more nuanced diagnoses, not just rigid labels. Second, they want to add a patient's real-life context into the mix. And third, the biggest goal of all, they want to bring in objective biological markers of illness. Now, that first part is a huge deal. Just imagine you're a doctor in the ER with someone having a psychotic episode. Right now, you might feel pressure to slap a specific label on them, like schizophrenia, even if you're not totally sure. This change would let you give a diagnosis with different levels of certainty, which is way more honest and, frankly, more helpful. And the new system also wants to formally look at a person's whole life. We're moving way beyond just a simple checklist of symptoms. We're talking about including crucial context, like their financial situation, other health problems they might have, and even their genetic background to paint a much, much fuller picture. Okay, so this brings us to the most ambitious and, you could say, the most controversial part of this entire plan, the hunt for actual biological proof of mental illness. I mean, think about it for a second. Could we one day have a simple blood test for bipolar disorder? Or maybe a brain scan that can spot depression? That is the absolute holy grail of this new approach, finding real, objective biological signs. So these biomarkers are just reliable biological signatures, like how a blood test can check for high cholesterol, or a really exciting recent example is the new blood test that can screen for Alzheimer's disease. That's actually one of the only huge success stories in a related field so far, but the hope is to find something similar for psychiatric conditions. The APA committee is incredibly optimistic. As one psychiatrist, Jonathan Albert, puts it, they think the question isn't if biomarkers belong in the DSM anymore, it's how to bring them in. They want the manual to be ready to go for when the science finally catches up. But a lot of other experts are pumping the brakes. Psychologist Ashley Watts shares a really common concern. Even if we find these markers, are they actually going to be useful in the real world? It could mean super expensive, invasive tests that might not even tell a doctor more than they could learn just by talking to the patient. And all this skepticism really points to a much deeper, more fundamental problem, one that some critics think the APA's new plan doesn't really fix at all. So you have really vocal critics like Steve Hyman, who used to run the National Institute of Mental Health, and they're arguing the problem isn't just about how we define the categories. The problem is the very idea of having these categories in the first place. What if that's just not how mental illness actually works? This whole model of grouping symptoms into categories was created way back in 1980. And there was this huge optimism that science, genetics, fancy brain scans, would eventually come along and prove that these categories were real biological things. But for decades, that proof just hasn't shown up. The hard scientific reality is that biology is messy. When researchers actually look at all the data, they find very few obvious clusters of illness. The lines between conditions we think of as totally separate, like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, turn out to be incredibly blurry when you look at the biology. This has led a lot of experts to suggest a pretty radical alternative. Instead of the current model, where you either have a disorder or you don't, like a switch is flipped, what if we thought about mental health as a spectrum? a continuum where these traits and symptoms exist in all of us, just to different degrees. So, what all this means is that the entire field of psychiatry is standing at this massive crossroads, with two very different paths for the future of diagnosis starting to emerge. On one path, you've got the APA, the official group, trying to reform the current system from the inside. They're trying to make the DSM more flexible, more scientific, and bring it into the 21st century. But then there's this other path, where a lot of scientists are already just leaving the DSM behind. Researchers who are trying to understand the deep biology of the brain are increasingly ignoring the DSM's categories because they see them as getting in the way of real progress. The big hope, as Steve Hyman says, is that one day these two paths will merge back together, that once science figures out enough about the underlying biology, all that new knowledge can be plugged back into the guide that doctors use every single day. But even he admits that day is probably a long, long way away. And that leaves us with a really critical and immediate question. While the scientists and the clinicians are walking down these two separate paths, what does all this mean for the millions of people just trying to get help and a clear answer right now, today?